Hi, and welcome to the Theater History Podcast. I'm Mike Leager. Canons have an important but complicated place in our culture. As definitive collections or lists of essential works of art and literature, they can be helpful guides and serve as a way to make sure that students, artists, and others share a common body of knowledge and experience. But they're also inherently exclusionary. Who decides what gets put into the canon and what gets left out? That's a particularly acute problem in American theater, where much of the canon of classic plays consists of works by white, often male authors, a state of affairs which often excludes the perspectives of BIPOC artists. For the last 5 years, the Classix project has been working together to change this, or, as they put it, quote, explode the classical canon through an exploration of Black performance history and dramatic works by Black writers. Today, we're very fortunate to be joined by two members of the Classix team. Dominique Rider is a director whose work focuses on a central question: what is a world unmade by slavery? In addition to serving as a producer for Classix, they're a resident director at the National Black Theatre. Arminda Thomas is a dramaturg, archivist, and musician. She served as the Associate Artistic Director and Resident Dramaturg for the Going to the River Festival, as well as the Literary Associate and Archivist for D. Davis Enterprises. Arminda and Dominique, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Hi, Mike. Thanks for having us today.
So let's just begin with the basic mission statement of Classix. What does it mean to explode the classical canon? And whose classic works are you hoping to bring to audiences' attention?
Yeah, that's a great first question. I think when we decided on that, I really like the word explode because it feels like taking dynamite and just sort of shoving it into the cracks of, I think, what are already there in the classic canon, and just pressing down and watching the thing explode so that you can focus not on what's at the top but what's at the bottom. So you can really get to the sort of bedrock, to the foundation of what we're talking about, which is really focusing in on the work of Black dramatists, in particular Black dramatists who have been forgotten and sort of passed over, or maybe were really popular during their time, as popular as they could be, and really trying to refocus attention to their works and how they are continuing to talk about the moments that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add to that because Dominique said that so well. I remember we had another word before explode, and I don't remember. It was probably expand or something like that.
I think it was expand. Yeah,
it was expand. But yeah, as we really talked about it, because expanding the canon is a wonderful and much used trope. But I don't know. It started to feel a little like, what does that actually mean? And as we expand, are we just really adding on to invalidating a canon when we expand it, or are we really just looking to fundamentally reshape our thoughts about it, our thoughts about, what we want to talk about when we talk about American theater?
And also, like, maybe sometimes, expanding isn't the thing you need to be doing. Like, sometimes I think what happens, especially as we talk about sort of inclusion and DEI, is that, like, the thing that happens is like, oh, we just need to elevate these plays to like the sort of levels of Death of the Salesman or whatever. And I think for us, it's like, actually, what if we don't talk about those plays at all? What if we sort of like don't even engage with that, and we're talking about something completely different, something that feels like maybe tangential to, but slightly different from the way we're thinking about canon? What if we maybe think about it as an archive as opposed to a canon?
So I understand that in this project of exploding the canon, there are kind of four main components to what you're doing. You mentioned productions, education, narrative, and publication. Could we start with education? Because I'm curious how you're going about rediscovering these classic plays and playwrights, and maybe if you could add on to that, how you hope to reshape the way that they're taught in academic settings.
Yeah, Arminda, do you want to start with that one?
Sure, absolutely. I think one of the ways that when we talk about educating, how do we approach it, is the challenge for Classix as a collective is immersion. Right. So we begin by just immersing ourselves in the writing. When we began, we just started reading all the plays that we could find. and all the plays that had been recommended. There were a lot of plays that were recommended to us by people like Woody King. Owoye tells a story about going to all the actors that she was working with on a George Wolfe play and saying, what was the play that you have worked on or read before and you'd really like to see again and has never come up again? And just throwing all these things into the mix and just diving in. Because, and I think I'll go back quickly to the canon thought, is to some extent that becomes hierarchical. And I think that that's something that Dominique was alluding to, and that you feel like, does it rise to the level of something instead of like, what is this thing? What is this thing? And why did it happen? And what does it tell us about these moments that we don't know? What does it tell us about these times that we don't know? And so it's just, so some of it was just kind of diving into the world and then saying, okay, what's interesting us? What's speaking to us? What are these, not just these plays, but perhaps these groupings of plays, these communities of writers that we don't know, these communities of performers and theater makers that we don't know about. And I think that one of the things that when we talk about, and this is going to be like a kind of education/narrative conversation, is that when we talk about it, we've begun to talk in terms of communities, in terms of, in the same way that when you sometimes you'll talk about the group theater, there are a whole bunch of people who have individual careers, but here's the seedbed for this, and here are the things that acted on this, and here are the ways that it reached out and latched itself into the tentacles of American theater. And so that's kind of the way that we've begun to talk about these things, or look at these things. So it's not just elevating one person, one writer, one moment. It's about looking at all of the factors that went into these works and these groupings, and just kind of unearthing that.
Yeah, and as far as the sort of education, the practical part of the education work goes, it's really about finding and partnering with schools and universities, because academia, especially theatrical academia, is really so much the bedrock of like the way we are trained to think about the canon, about theater history, and really trying to find ways to one, help and figure out what students need. And then also on sort of a curriculum level, it's like, well, do you need to be teaching this play you loved when you were in school? Is that the most helpful thing right now? And really trying to find ways to like shift curriculums and ask questions about curriculums. How do curriculums get made? Why do curriculums get made the way they get made? And why does it seem like, for artists of color, Black artists in particular, it's like when we talk about theater history, it's like relegated to a day, as opposed to really thinking about the sort of the longevity of a lot of Black theatrical works. And so I think that is sort of the first place we start. And we're working with Princeton a lot on that right now. And there are some other fun partnerships that are coming down the pipeline. But I think Princeton has been our sort of flagship program when it comes to education.
Now, the word narrative has come up a few times. Arminda, I think you just used it, kind of talking about it in connection with education. What is the narrative component? I think, education, publication, production, those words are all a little bit self-evident. Like, okay, that means a certain thing, but what does narrative mean in terms of the mission of Classix?
Well, I mean, in a very practical way, what it means for us is we're launching a podcast, but even when we talk about the education, well, it's how you frame the story, right? It's how you frame the story of that's what a narrative is. It's how you frame the story of the plays and playwrights and artists, and it's a intentional choice about where you're going to focus your attention, right? So are you going to focus it on, this is the production history of this piece, this is this playwright, and this is where they came, and this is, all the things that they did? Or is it going to be, here's this playwright, here are these other people, not just this playwright, but here's this performer that this playwright worked with all the time. Here are these directors. Here are these producers or people who wanted to be producers. Here's the city, or the town. Here's the events that are going around. Here's what the movement looks like, or what here's the context. Right. So narrative is context, and if you have a context for works, it deepens our appreciation, I think, of the foundations, right? Because I think that we tend to think of particularly Black theater, but I think all theater that is kind of outside of the mainstream is the first, right? This is the first play by a woman. This is the first play. This is the first produced play. This is the first da 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 da. But so often there's another story, there's another layer, and it's kind of and it's been piled over, and so you're always just kind of telling stories about exceptional moments, right? And I think that we want to get away from that because so much of theater and so much of history is not about these exceptional moments, but about these people, these groups who have come together in the face of whatever is going on to try to create art. And that's what we do, right? That's what we're doing. We're coming together and trying to create art. So it's about, on some level, just drawing inspiration from that. And actually, when you go to education, as you work with students, and what's the best way if you're coming into the world of theater as young students, it's find your peers, find the people who are who are interested in things you're interested in, and try to do it that way. Don't send yourself through all of these hoops that you think you have to go through to be at this place or with these people. It's kind of an inspiring grassroots, right? That's what I think of. So that's my particular angle on the narrative. I'm not saying everybody at Classix believes that, but that's what I think of when I think of narrative. Dominique?
Yeah, I think everything you just said, I really agree with. And I think, too, a thing that I'm always trying to sort of dispel in my own work, and I think it's deeply connected to everything you just said, is that there is no singular genius, right? That like these playwrights, these artists are not just sort of like falling out of the sky, knowing that they are, right? Alice Childers doesn't just fall out of the sky and know that trouble in mind is going to come out of her, right? Like she is made not in isolation actually, but actually she's made in community. She's made deeply in connection with other artists who are other artists, other thinkers, other like activist organizers, right? Who are shaping the way, helping to change the way that she is thinking about the world, and the work gets to reflect that, right? And so I think that one important part of the narrative is that you actually don't have to do this thing alone, that there are people who are both, right, like in sort of the peer-to-peer sense of like Alice Childress is still writing with us right now. You are not writing alone, but also that as a writer, you can be made in community. There are people who can stand with you in the process and like help and sharpen you in the way you want to be sharpened. And that is not, it shouldn't be a unique thing, I think is my big thing.
Yeah, and to the point that you're both making there about how it's not just isolated artists. When it comes to publication, I think Classix has a really interesting philosophy, and I wonder if you could tell us more about it. It doesn't just sound like, well, here's this playwright who hasn't been published or hasn't been published in a while. We should probably put out a new edition of the play. You're talking about talking with people who, as you put it, living legends, people who have experienced this, who experienced some of the history of these plays. Could you tell us a little bit when it comes to publication? What are you going for? What's the philosophy there?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're working on a new publication, an anthology series right now with Princeton University, and I feel like the thing that's always important is like just this might sound bad, but like making sure that like it's not just artists talking about other artists, right? That like that plays don't just exist in theater, that they also exist and have a reach like in other disciplines. And so it feels really important when talking about publishing, not just to have the plays or not just to have like the original cast member of said play writing about it, which is deeply important, right? And it's like, and I think it's a thing. It's one of my favorite things about doing work with Classix is like you do a reading and there's going to be a Black person there that saw this play when it premiered or like was in the play when it premiered. And that's always so special. And it's also like, right, like having that perspective on it. And then also maybe like a Black feminist who's been obsessed with this play for 20 years in her career, but hasn't been able to write about it, right? That it really feels like, to me, what we're interested in, and I think what makes it so exciting is like the theatrical perspective is always important, but there are so many other ways to think about plays that are not just like playwrights talking about it, or directors talking about it, or actors talking about it, right? What does it mean to talk about like a play like Big White Fog with like a Marxist organizer, right? Like, what are the things that get unlocked in that play, in that organizer for each other, right? And how do we talk about that? I think is one thing I really love about how we think about publishing, and why. Yeah, I don't want to read an anthology series that's just like theater people talking about plays. I can just I work here. I can do that any day of the week.
Oh, was I supposed to follow that? I try not to follow Dominique. But yes. So all of that. So the different angles on works. Also, the piece we're thinking about, just in addition to forces out, areas outside of theater. Again, just the communities that we don't know about. So this piece that we're working about, we're hoping to unearth some plays to include in this anthology, but we're also hoping to be able to tell stories about these communities where they came out of. We're talking about the Federal Theater Project Negro units, not just who they were, but we're discovering that a lot of these units were built on earlier performing groups that we don't necessarily know about, that we didn't know existed in cities that we don't think about as being theatrical places. And so just, I think for us, we're always trying to find out, we're always trying to unearth new stories, new people and performers and groups that we just don't know. So for us, it's always just kind of excavating and then saying, oh, here's this thing we found.
Yeah, I'm particularly curious, Arminda, how you approach that work, given that you are, a dramaturg and an archivist. Dominique, I thought it was so interesting that a little while ago you were saying we almost don't want to think of it as a canon. We want to think of it as an archive. But Arminda, from kind of your particular professional perspective, what does that work like? And I guess maybe what are some of the challenges and also some of the opportunities? It's got to be on one level perhaps frustrating to come across these stories, these plays that haven't really been adequately appreciated. But on the other hand, I got to imagine sometimes it's kind of like finding a sort of treasure, if you will.
Oh yeah, it's a lot of fun. I mean, and I mean, there's some things where I try to remember, and this is the thing that I, as we talk about things. So, for instance, as we were going through Alice Childress, and I think Owoye and I and Dominique perhaps also have, a kind of story of discovering Alice Childress as full-grown adults, already theater makers, already kind of trained to be in the world this way, and then discovering that there's a playwright that we should have known. We should have known this playwright, and that really spurs us. And if you come up in a certain way in theater, that would be your story too. But as we're working with groups, we're discovering that, some people younger than we are, some people older, some people who came through Howard, some people who came through Spelman, some people who came through other groups were like, yeah, we read Alice Childress in college. So something that's hidden to me is not necessarily hidden. Right. And that is a thing that I like to try to keep in mind. So how does that answer your question about archives? It doesn't. but I felt like it was really something that I wanted to get out there because I'm trying to like approach things through a certain amount of humility and understanding that that is also a blessing. Actually, it does kind of get to where I'm going with archiving, because so many of these pieces were published, had a life. It's been buried. It's been forgotten. It's been papered over, but it's there. We can find it because it's there. We're not, we're not Dead Sea scrolling here, really. It's a Google. It's an old out of print collection. It's, and then going through those and doing the work and going, who is this person? What is this? and finding old reviews. Sometimes you can do that. Sometimes it really is that kind of simple. It just hasn't been done in a while, or it was done in a different context. And it's just trying to wrap your mind around that. So, but also, there are places where we're really interested in getting into, because there are places where there are plays and works that have just kind of lingered or abandoned. Getting into Alice Childers's archives at the Schomburg, there are so many drafts. We'll talk about them later, I know, but unpublished works that were produced once, but maybe there's no final draft, but they were produced once, and if they were produced once, they can be produced again, right? So just kind of trying to not define, but to explore bodies of work, I think, is a thing that can be challenging. One of the things you asked about challenging, I'm gonna get there. One of the things that's challenging is that there's not always a lot of writing that's done about things. So there's not always an easy roadmap. It's not necessarily, there's not just an easy path in all the time. But that's also the fun thing, just how deeply can I go into some strange corner of, how many footnotes can I accumulate to get to this source, is sometimes, an interesting experiment. When we were reading on, I don't remember the piece that we were reading on, but I know it was Childress related. And I remember just saying this statement. And the statement is well, how do I know this? How do I know that this is true? And here's a footnote, and this footnote seems to be quoting this thing, and I go to that thing, and how do I know that is true? And then it's just dig and dig and dig and dig and dig and finding this thing. Goes, oh, that's how I know it's true. Okay, great. I feel good now. Maybe I don't have to be so skeptical, but I like being able to get to this space. And then also I learn a lot of other things while I'm going on that dig, and that is, so the journey for me is the exciting part. We were doing we'll talk about it later, I'm sure, but we were, while we were working on the Minstrelsy podcast, there's so little that's written. I mean, there are things that are written about Black minstrelsy and Black minstrel troops, but they're kind of tangential a lot of the time, or their oral history. And even that is not all that easy to find. And so just digging around there and going through newspapers, because now you can, there's an archive of Midwestern newspapers from the 19th century that wasn't really available to scholars before. And you can just get lost. You can just get lost finding little bitty reviews of these things that weren't there before, and you can kind of track in a way that you couldn't track. So yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the really exciting things, is that we are in an era where it is easier on some level. Once you have decided to focus on something, it's easier to do that tracking.
Now, in addition to publication, education, narrative, we mentioned production is a major focus of what Classix is doing. And you've both already been involved with a number of readings and productions in the last 5 years. Listeners to this podcast might remember episode 85. We've had a discussion about some of the plays produced by the Negro units of the Federal Theater Project in the 1930s. And I understand last year you were both involved in an event at Princeton that featured readings and discussion of some of these plays. I think, Dominique, you already mentioned Big White Fog, this major play from the 1930s. Would you both be willing to talk a little bit about what that was like, putting on these readings, and maybe what those particular plays have to say to us now?
Sure. What was it like? Being sort of both, doing sort of dual work of curator and then director, it was actually quite funny, because when I hate reading plays, and I'll get that out of the way now. I do not enjoy reading plays. I read pieces of Big White Fog, and I was like, I don't know, y'all. I don't know if this is the one we need to be doing. I don't know if I really like this play. And then I let the other two directors sort of pick, and Big White Fog was the one that I got. And then reading through it the first day with actors. It was just an excerpt. I was like, oh, this is wild. This is actually a stunning play that's really deeply trying to get at something. And I think Big White Fog in particular is sort of this, it's this, for those who don't know, it's this sort of really big, sprawling epic about the relationship between Black folks, capitalism, and communism. And it's set in the 1920s, Arminda? The 1920s, okay, I give the nod. It's set during the 1920s and is about this family and the sort of 10, 15-year journey this family takes in one home. And the thing that I think the big thing that I learned from that play and from directing the excerpt that I did is that as a director, one of my sort of, much like our wonderful founder, Awoye Tempo, a thing I hate is like, why is this play in a home? What is the use of this play being in a house? Why do you want me to have a couch? Why do we need these things? And I think the big thing I learned from dealing with Big White Fog and then reading it, right, is because sometimes the only place you can deal with each other is in the home. That maybe if you were Black and in the streets talking about communism, the state is already on you. The state's going to be on you in a slightly more severe way, right? And that the only place you can think to organize, the only place you can really deal with the sort of ideas are in the home. And I think that Big White Fog's really sort of demands about the way that Black folks need to consider communism, the way that Black folks are not being aided by capitalism uniquely because they are Black, I think has a lot to talk to us about. And then, I mean, I think the two other plays too, what is the Living Newspaper?
The Living Newspaper, Liberty Deferred.
Liberty Deferred and
it
Natural
feels like
Man. So long ago.
And Natural Man. Yes.
Yeah. Are both equally beautiful and are such interesting, especially the Living Newspaper of it all, I think is really an interesting sort of idea. And I feel like, Arminda, you could really talk about that.
I think I could. Well, I mean, I will say that for me, I didn't actually dramaturg a piece, but I got to really, I got to pick the plays or suggest. I got to strongly suggest the plays. And
when Arminda song suggests, we listen.
No. I mean, and some of it is, of course, that we only had so many pieces that we could do, and so many that were available, and that has sent us on a different excursion. But so the plays that we ended up picking, Natural Man, which is a piece that was done by Theodore Brown, because sorry, I'm under-caffeinated, but that was done by Theodore Brown, who was out of the Seattle project. And okay, there was a Seattle project, and I'm always trying to get over that, because I do not think of a strong Black theater community in Seattle. It's not a thing that you necessarily, I mean, it's there now, but I don't think of it as being, necessarily there in the 30s. And so that's a learning thing, because a lot of work came out of there. And Theodore Brown was really influential in that, but also then came to New York and was with the Harlem Suitcase Writers, and Natural Man had a life beyond that moment in the 30s. It was done, by the American Negro Theater in 40 and 41. They redid it. It was popular. And so just kind of focusing on this piece that had a life for a minute and then disappeared, I think was really exciting. And it's a John Henry myth, and I love, it's a take on John Henry, and I love takes on John Henry. I just that felt important. And also, they focused in a way on kind of hobo, on being, homeless and nomadic and things with the law. I mean, there's just so much going on with that piece that it just felt like really exciting to unearth. And then Liberty Deferred, which was a Living Newspaper piece that did not see production, was, in fact, one of the reasons that the Federal Theater Project, went under, because pieces like this were even got as far as they got without being produced. And it was a piece that was about kind of the history of Black people and living under white supremacy in America, and that struggle, and it used all kinds of, as Living Newspapers did, it used like little statistics, little skits, vaudevillian / minstrel elements are in it. It's, and it's just really fascinating. It's just really, it's a fascinating eclectic piece. It's probably a little too long because it didn't get to a rehearsal. Rehearsals are really important for cementing pieces, I think, which is a thing that we know. But if you're just reading plays, you don't necessarily understand how important it is to throw actors in a room to get a piece fermented thoroughly. But it's just a really fascinating work, and really, I mean, it resonates in a lot of ways with the kind of conversations that we still have surrounding, well, why, you have a couple that's coming in to see, that's coming in to partake of culture. They're a white couple, and they're kind of, they're slumming in a Harlem nightclub or whatever. They're coming to partake of culture and being confronted with, their complicity in the stories that are being told. And it's just, those were just great to work on, because it had never been produced. So we wanted to have some of that. And also because it was co-written by Abram Hill, who went on to to found the American Negro Theater and be part of so many things before that too. So it felt like an important kind of jumping off point.
Dominique, you addressed a little bit of this in talking about your work with Big White Fog. I'm curious, for you as a director, you mentioned this, but you're sort of wearing the hat of curator and in a way a little bit of the archivist, I suppose, as well. What is it like to engage with these texts? What maybe is different about it for you compared to some of the other work that you've done?
It's a great question. I think that, all right, so again, I hate reading plays, and that sort of is the first of it all, right? Like generally when I'm encountering these plays, I am doing so sort of in a literary sense. And I'm always just like, I just need to hear this out loud because I don't know, y'all. I don't know. But I think the thing that always surprises me is that, not even surprises me because it's expected because of what they're talking about, is just sort of how relevant and timely and urgent all of the plays that I engage with feel. Because it's like, I think that one thing that happens is like people are trying to write towards the moment or to the moment. And right, like the problem of the moment is that like it is ongoing, right? That's the problem of empire, right? It's not history repeating, it's empire persisting. And you get these real looks in the 80s and the 70s and the 60s and the 40s and the 50s of people really trying to wrestle with against empire and the way empire shows up. And I think for me, like the way that sometimes, and I know it's like deep craft, but the way it sometimes feels so easy, the way it sometimes feels like, Alice Childress is a genius. She is one of many, but the way that Trouble in Mind is able to tackle, right, like not just sort of rehearsal rooms as plantations, but also the sort of crisis of trying to be an entertainer in the era of like McCarthyism and what that means. Right, the things you can show up to, what it means about the things you support, and also like I think really Childress specifically, like the psychological toll that like what it means to be Black in close proximity to white people when they have all the power in space, right? That it really requires a sort of performance, especially in Trouble in Mind, right? Like you're not just performing a character, you're also having to perform for the white people to make them feel comfortable, to make them feel good, to make them feel like you're on their side. And I think that like the sort of complexities that are so found in those texts, the sort of real ways they are trying to get at things that are so big, oftentimes feel really refreshing to me. And it doesn't feel like didactic. It doesn't feel boring in any way. It feels really exciting and fulfilled. And so the sort of struggle I always have is like, oh, you should just give me a production of this now. So let me like work it out. So let me like figure out what's going on. Because there are some of them, I just directed a reading of this play called The Mojo and the Say-So by Aisha Rahman at the National Black Theater. And going into that play, I've had it for almost 2 years. And going into that play, I was like, I don't know if this works. Because this language don't make sense to me just reading it on the page, right? And then hearing it out loud, hearing it in space, hearing what it does, clarified so many questions that I'd had, clarified more than questions, clarified what it is, like the actual shape of the play. And so I think that the big thing working, and sort of this sort of curatorial archival lens is really like, what is this play doing? How can we give this play to someone that is really going to pick it up and carry it and do what needs to be done? Or like, how do we really make sure that this play is getting the second look that it deserves, the second glance that it needs? Versus me as a director, sometimes it's all of those things, but it's also like, I don't need to fuck some shit up. And this is a good fuck some shit up play. I'm so sorry, Michael. I don't know if cussing is allowed on this podcast.
You're absolutely welcome to use whatever language you wish.
Great. And I think a lot of those old plays are really interested in, right, because they're coming out of so many types of, and not to romanticize them in any way, right? But like a lot of these plays are post-Black Power. A lot of these plays are during civil rights. A lot of these plays are during the Cold War, right? Like there are so many different types of thought being produced then in ways that like academia has sort of insulated them now. And I think that like really being able to engage with all of those feels so important and so necessary to actually even being able to talk about what good theater might look like.
Now, this past season, the Classix project was in residency at Theater for a New Audience in New York.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned Owoye Timpo, who is, the main founder, I understand, of Classix.
Indeed.
Yes. She directed Alice Childress's Wedding Band. And I also understand that you've announced the launch of a forthcoming podcast that's connected with this residency, and which you mentioned earlier. Would you be willing to talk a little bit about the residency and maybe also what your plans are for the project going forward?
Wedding Band Show of the Year. That's all I have to say, Arminda. That's it.
So we started talking to Theater for a New Audience in 2019 about doing a residency there of readings. That was and with the hope that some of them would make it to productions, but we really wanted a house for readings, and that's where we're moving. And so the first thing we did was we did a reading in February 2020, and we decided that we wanted to kick off with Alice Childress because we feel some kind of way about Alice Childress, and we all feel that way. And so we started there, and we, for a couple of reasons, one being completely practical, which is, though we did not know it, Trouble in Mind was not available for a reading, but also, I don't know if we might have been able to do it for the reading. I can't remember, but we couldn't have done it for production, but I really wanted to do Wedding Band. And I agree with all of the things that Dominique says about Trouble in Mind. Trouble in Mind is a brilliant play, and it tackles all of these things. And Wedding Band is just so, I just feel like there's something that is so visceral and deep about Wedding Band and the way it dives into these relations in a way that Trouble in Mind, like it gets at them, and they get at each other. And there's a lot of talk about what it is to be, kind of an ally, that's a thing that's happening in Trouble in Mind, that these are ostensibly people who are all on the same side, who are also coming apart at the seams. And then when you get to Wedding Band, it's that, and it's also their family, or they're supposed to be family, or, they don't know that they're, or, on some, that, it's a community, they don't know their family, but by the end of 3 days, they become, deeply enmeshed. And this woman finds a family that she did not necessarily know she needed, and then has to really confront the brokenness in the family that she has been trying to have with this man who loves her and yet still carries history and the place with him and in him, and he has to confront that because he doesn't know that either. And he's dying. And that's, that's another problem. But the struggle to make these things true for themselves, this thing that they've been telling themselves for 10 years, that they are married, that they are together, that they are to confront the ways in which, that has actually been a failure, and then try to make it true in the time that they have. So there's just something that I deeply love about Wedding Band, and that it's actually about that, but also about this community of women who have no power or varying, limited access to they are in this backyard where, they are not sheltered from the rules of the world. That world intrudes on them all the time, but they are still able to create this space for themselves to kind of live out the goals that they have for themselves and try to and eventually on some level help each other, even though they are often at odds. So it's, it's just this, I didn't say that right, but you know what I mean. Anyway, it's just this beautiful, beautiful, deep piece. So we did this reading. That's what I was going to say. So we did this reading in 2020 in February, and it went really well. And Jeffrey Horowitz said, we're going to do this play. Because he had been a little bit skeptical before. He's like, Trouble in Mind, everybody's Trouble in Mind. But Wedding Band is a play that I think, as Dominique said about Aisha Rahman, Wedding Band is a play that you really have to hear. You have to hear. You can read it and go, wow, that's kind of deep. But is it a little bit here, or is it polemical here? And then it comes out and you go, oh no, because that's it. That comes from a place deep inside. That comes from places that you have to experience the way that comes out to know that you got to do that piece. And so he said, yes, we're going to do that piece. And then, and then it was March of 2020. And so we had to, so while we were waiting to, and you couldn't do any readings. So the residency, which was supposed to be readings and this production of Wedding Band, we tried to figure out how to make that work in virtual land. And what we came up with was the podcast, which we figured we could, knock some of those out real fast. And then we decided to do Minstrelsy, and that's going to launch soon. But it was, so the podcast came out of a need to try to still tell these stories, still honor this residency, and Theater for a New Audience was really supportive and helpful with the, supporting that mission. So that's how that is how the podcast was born in the residency, and so we're gonna get to share the fruits of it starting next month. I think, is that right, Dominique? We're launching next month. Yeah.
Yeah, which is wild to say out loud, but yeah, that's happening.
Yes. So yeah, that's and so our plans going forward. What are our plans going forward?
I mean, I think we've been doing pretty great. So it feels like it's just
we're just moving. There are some things that we hope to. We did another thing that we worked on in conjunction with a few other groups over the summer outside of Theater for New Audience was we did a reading of Bill Gunn's Black Picture Show for our artist space. Yeah. And we filmed it because, for our artist space, and it got us showing at Metrograph. And it was it feels like I'm really proud of that work. That's what I'll say. I'm really proud of that work. And I think Owoye and all of the cast and the cinematographer, I think they just did such a marvelous job. And it feels like both a very complete thing and also something that we really want to dive into again. So we're really hoping to spend some more time on and with Bill Gunn and his work. So that is an intention that we have. But we don't have a set announcement for that. But that's an intention that I know we have.
If you don't mind my asking, so the podcast you're saying is going into Minstrelsy?
Okay, yes.
Yeah, I'm just curious what it's going to focus on and why tackle that particular topic.
Okay, so the podcast is called Reclamation, and it is a way of, you have that language, right, Dominique? Reclamation, where we center and uplift the Black experience in various theater eras of theater and theater moments and movements. And so it is part of our narrative branch. And we were thinking about what is it that we want to start on. So the way we envision Reclamation is we have it in acts, right? So we're planning a few acts. One, the first one that we've completed and are about to launch on Black performance in the era of minstrelsy. Another is looking at the artists who worked in and lived in and around Nyack, New York, and the work that they did. Another podcast on Alice Childress. We're thinking about one on ritual theater. So these are the acts, and then within each act there are 5 or 6 episodes to kind of hone in. And we started with minstrelsy because I think because it's a thing that we didn't know, that we don't know much about, and because there's a lot of just deep and conflicted and complex feelings about it. And when we think about it, we tend to think about the damage of it. But it also was, while deeply damaging, also kind of foundational for the artists who were coming, who, for a kind of burgeoning generation of theater artists who this was the form that they had to work in, and coming out of, some of them coming out of slavery, some of them, just being able finally in the era of Reconstruction to be able to work freely and to move about, and and to develop communities in a way that, when we think about the African Grove Theater, which cast a long shadow, and is particularly Ira Aldridge, but had, had, like, I think, a deep psychological, spiritual, it had an impression. People named themselves, their groups, after Ira Aldridge long after he was gone. So absolutely influential, but not in the way of being able to form communities and training, and, and really just kind of launch a type of theater, which happened because of performers working in minstrelsy. So we really wanted to figure out what that was. James Weldon Johnson said that, that the Black theater was built on the minstrel stage. And we wanted to really explore that and figure out what that, what that meant. And we just didn't know enough. So that's why we started with that. And it was just really interesting and fascinating, and, to go back and then to look at, I think we looked at In Dahomey kind of specifically, which was, if we're doing first, like the first Black play on Broadway, Williams and Walker and Dahomey, but also getting to look at those communities, particularly Burt Williams, who is well known to the extent that he's well known because he was part of the Ziegfeld Follies, which kind of takes him out of the context as one of the originators and innovators of the Black theater community in the early 1900s and in the late 19th and early 20th century. And so we just wanted to put him back.
There's all this exciting new work coming out today. And I guess as sort of a big picture, kind of starting to wrap things up here, I'm curious why you both feel, or how you feel, that these, classics, these plays that we've been talking about today, that you've been working with, how do those complement the new work? I think, Dominique, you said earlier that, something to the effect that moments are always kind of ongoing. It's not a sort of frozen point in time. Things keep moving forward. So how do these classics complement the new work that's coming out today?
I'd actually love to maybe reframe that question slightly. How does the new work today complement the classics of then? I think is actually the way that question needs to be asked, because how do you get Fairview without Trouble in Mind? Right? How do you get Slave Play without Alice Childress? Right? How do you? I'm right. That I think one thing that becomes so, to me at least, apparent is reading a lot of these plays, reading a lot of these older plays, and being like, I can see the tendrils of this in new work, right? That I can see the legacy, even if the person maybe has never read the playwright in mind, right? Like, I spent some time a couple of weeks ago reading a lot of Ed Bullins' plays, because he passed not too long ago. And a connection I see that no one is talking about, and I've now talked to her about it, right? Is like, Ed Bullins' sort of experiments in ritual theater feel so deeply connected to what Alicia Harris is doing, right? Even though she has not read any of his plays, according to her, there is such a connection to me that you see. And I think it's important because it does a couple of things, but I think maybe the most important one is, like, it allows for the thing Arminda said at the beginning, right? Like, black writers aren't the first. And that's an important thing, that actually you are standing in a long tradition, that there is an origin point, that there is a thing you come from, right? That you can be connected to if you choose to, that feels so important to me. I feel like I spend a lot of my time sort of forcing all of my friends who are writers, Black writers especially, to go see Alice Childress plays, to read Alice Childress plays, right? And the sort of big feedback that I've gotten is like, oh, I maybe wouldn't have written this play if I'd read Wedding Band when I was in college, maybe I wouldn't have needed to write this play or feel the need to write this play if I'd seen Trouble in Mind, right? And I think that that is a compliment. And I think also, again, it provides an origin point and a place of starting, a place of reaching for, that I think is so important. And not to say, right, that Black playwrights can have non-Black inspirations. They absolutely can. But I think that like being able to, I'm not interested in the representation of like seeing someone who looks like you, but seeing someone who is writing about the things that you care about in ways that you care about them feels so important. And I think for me, like, it becomes, because a lot of those plays are so much dealing with like genre and specific topics, it really expands for me as a director the way I can talk about new plays, right? Because I am very quick to be like, this ain't, it's like, oh, this play is inspired by Alice Childress. How do we deal with it now, right? Like, how do we talk about it? How can we really work on it in that way? And so it feels so important to have the context of before, so we can deal with not only artistically what's happening now, but also like, what are the ramifications of the things they were writing about not being dealt with, right? How are we still dealing with the Cold War? How are we still dealing with the fallout from the Black Power movement? How are those things still affecting and shaping, oftentimes negatively because of the way that they get repressed? How are those things affecting the way that we think about art, what is possible in art? How is it limiting our imaginations for what might be possible? And so I think looking at those older plays feels really important in talking about new ones. And I don't know, I'm tired of reading reviews where it's like, you don't know what history is and you can't talk about history. So,
I mean, for me, I think it's that second one. It's the first one too, but it's really the second one, this need to position where it feels like, I think because it's true, that Black playwrights and Black plays tend to be treated as if they're just kind of floating out in the ether. This just bubbled out from nowhere. This is just, here we are. Here's this moment. Here's this piece. Isn't that lovely? Lorraine, yeah, here's A Raisin in the Sun. It came out of where? Nowhere. And so we'll do it over and over and over again. And that feels really ungrateful, because before we started doing over and over again, it was buried for a good, it was away, not buried because there were televised productions of it, but not done in the way that it's been done in the last, say, 20 years. Every 10 years, the only thing you do. But I'm gonna stop, right? Because it's a great piece and it comes from somewhere. And Lorraine Hansberry comes from somewhere. And it's important not to we get tired of things because they feel like they're just, I'm doing this hammer motion. They're just like hammered into us. This is the only thing. This is the one. This is it. Lorraine Hansberry, one play, and August Wilson's 10, and that's what you got. That's history. It's like, no, and also not alone. And so I think that as we offer this work and we explore this work, we're not offering, we're exploring, and we're coming back and we're offering you our observations. Here's our journey, and here are some pieces, and we want to talk about them here. And and part of the podcast, we know we can't produce everything and we can't have readings of everything ourselves, but we want to, and we have it on our website. We have a database that we're building. So I think that's important to say, of pieces and playwrights and ways to access these pieces, so that the conversation can never, we just, a lot of our early conversations were this idea that you have no foundation is, I think, damaging and pernicious. And it's a story that gets told to us every 20 years or so, that, this is the first we're saying of this. This is, what is this related to? Here we are, a singular voice. It's not, it's not. And there's joy in that, in being part of it, in standing in a foundation, standing in a tradition, in breaking from it. How can you break from something if you don't know it?
You don't know it.
Right.
Yeah.
You have to understand the space you're in order to move out of the space you're in. So I guess.
Yeah. And I think one more thing to your point, I think for me as a director, a thing I encounter a lot is people thinking Black history is just, like, theater history is just sort of like realistic plays about families and couches and shit. And it's like, no, that is a type and a modality of writing. There is so much more right? There's so many different types of Black plays. And I think that knowing those also helps expand how to talk about new ones, right?
Mhm.
Like if I can talk about Aisha Rahman's absurdism and what she's dealing with in her absurdism, right? Because in a world where a Black mother can lose their child to the cops, like that's absurdity, right? What is realism then? I think is really important in just the way we talk about plays, because like our shit doesn't always have to be real. And it's always like, oh, you're dealing with like social justice themes, so it must be real. Girl, shut up. This is absurd. Literally, the world we live in is absurd, right? And how do you deal with that? And so I think that that is also super important when we talk about like being able to talk about genre, being able to talk about scope. And yeah, everything Arminda just said, because who has the time? And also, again, it goes back to the academia thing, right? Like if the only thing you can compare a Black playwright to is a white play, right? Like there might be similarities, but like what is the point of origin? How do you talk about Susan Laurie Parks without talking about Kennedy, right? Like, and what does it mean to be able to really have those sort of deeper conversations? And who does it open up to like thinking differently about lineage and plays? I think is so important.
One sort of final question. In the course of working on this project for both of you, is there any just particular play or work or something you've come across where you just think this needs a production? People need to know about this. I'm just curious from a kind of a personal perspective for both of you. Have you had that sort of moment where you're just like, people need to know about this, and not enough people are aware of this playwright, this play, this theater company, or this event?
All the time. Like I really wish I could be like, oh, there's just one, but I feel like so many of the plays we read, I'm just like, oh, why can't this is ready to go? You know, Bill Gunn, like Arminda was saying earlier, Aisha Rahman, who I keep mentioning, any of the playwrights that we did at Princeton, Theodore Brown, Theodore Ward, because I think oftentimes what I think about, maybe sometimes more than the plays, is actually the legacies of these people. And it always, like Childress, for instance, or Theodore Ward, who wrote Big White Fog, I always think about, because he was the first Black dramatist to ever win the Guggenheim Fellowship, right? Like, and the thing that disappears him is McCarthyism, because it's like, why are you talking about communism? And how many Black writers are being disappeared, both here and abroad, because of the work that they are producing, because of what they are talking about. So there feel like I could give you an infinite amount of answers, and it still wouldn't be enough.
Well, I mean, for me to start, it was Alice Childress.
Always, forever.
To start, it was Alice Childress, and every time I work on Alice Childress, I go, we need to do more Alice Childress. But I feel like for the moment, if not forever, and hopefully we can embed it so that it's forever, that is a common feeling. Mm-hmm. That's beginning to be that's something that seems to have caught the zeitgeist, and so I will say that another area that I'm interested in is women writers from the Harlem Renaissance and from that series, and that often get ignored because they wrote one-act plays, because one-act plays don't get done in the same way, but it wrote really deep and interesting and sometimes funny and sometimes tragic one-act plays. Marita Bonner, who kind of began surrealism in plays that, you know, she said these are plays that you can't stage, because I guess at that point it was hard to imagine staging them, but the thought behind them is, there's definitely a line from them to Susan Laurie Parks, to Adrienne Kennedy, to that work, and Eulalie Spence, who wrote these just really insightful and funny, and sometimes and disturbing, sometimes character pieces, and wrote a lot of plays that were produced into the 30s and then kind of disappeared. So, and I would love to re-examine her work. I did readings with New Perspective Theater on Georgia Douglas Johnson's work, some of which she's associated with doing some anti-lynching plays, which she did, but she also did more folk type plays. She did a lot of writing, and a lot of her writing just got lost. We have a piece of hers where she kept her own archive. Like, she cataloged the plays that she wrote. She cataloged them by type. We have that, but she didn't have children. And when she died, her nephews or whoever was left just dumped a lot of her stuff, just ended up in the big trash. So she has like 28 plays or so, and we have maybe 7 of them. And that is tragic and sad to me. And I want to go like comb through archives of, Howard and say, do you have buried in your office a play that we know about? But even the ones that we have, I feel really committed to finding ways to get those out, because one act plays are great.
Yeah,
one act plays
and they're important,
and they are, and so just finding ways to lift those up, that's another thing. And always more Bill Gunn and Kathleen Collins.
It's always and.
It's always and. I will, and I think that we maybe haven't paid enough attention to Elaine Jackson. So I mean, as I'm going, I think I started with of the Harlem Renaissance because it gives me a way in. What's the focus and what are these communities and how are these women writing with each other, the salons that they're in together, and how Eulalie Spence is kind of not in that group, but also kind of in that group, and how to, I'm just really fascinated by these communities and, and how that writing can be explored in that context.
We'll post links in our show notes that will help you to learn more about the Classix project, including that database that Arminda mentioned, and some of the playwrights whose work it has championed. Dominique and Arminda, thank you both for introducing us to this exciting and essential project.
Thanks so much for having us, Mike.
Thank you so much, Michael.
If you'd like to continue today's conversation, please visit theaterhistorypodcast.net and follow @theaterhistory on Twitter. Just a note, theater is spelled THEATRE in our website URL, and it's spelled TER at the end in our Twitter handle. Our theme music is The Black Crook Gallop, which comes to us courtesy of the New York Public Library Libretto Project and Adam Roberts. Thanks as well to Tip Kress, who designed our logo. And finally, thank you for listening.